The assault kicked off before Commander Rourke Vance finished his sentence, and the sentence was about her. "I've read your file twice, Sergeant Merrick, and I still don't see how a woman with 11 months in theater ends up running my overwatch," he said, standing at the lip of the ridge with his binoculars still capped, looking at her like a piece of equipment somebody had requisitioned by mistake. Below us, the valley of Anders Hollow spread out flat and pale in the early light, and dug into the tree line 800 meters out. 30-some enemy fighters were waiting for our lead element to walk into the open ground between the ridge and the river. Dana Merrick didn't look up from her rifle. She was running her hand along the barrel one last time, checking the bipod tension, and she said, "You will," in a voice so unbothered it almost sounded like agreement with him. That was when the first shots cracked from the tree line, and our lead squad, 20 men under Lieutenant Price, went to ground in the open exactly where the enemy wanted them. I was Vance's radio operator that morning, new to his command element. 3 weeks into a posting I still didn't fully understand the politics of. I had heard the talk in the mess tent the night before, soldiers muttering about the new sniper attached to the Overwatch team. A woman with a record nobody had bothered to actually read past the cover page. Vance himself had said as much to his executive officer over coffee that morning, not unkindly, just plainly, the way a man states a fact he's confident of. That command had sent him a name instead of a proven quantity, and he intended to find out which one he'd actually gotten before he trusted her with anything that mattered. Now, with the valley erupting below us, I watched him grab his own rifle like he meant to solve this personally, the way commanders sometimes do when the plan goes sideways fast and pride mistakes itself for leadership. Merrick's hand on his forearm stopped him before he'd taken a full step. "Sir," she said, "you lead, I shoot. Let me do the part I'm good at." He looked at her for one long second, jaw tight, the whole ridge shuddering with the sound of Price's squad taking fire they couldn't answer from flat ground. Then he said, "Do it," because whatever his doubts, he didn't have a better plan, and good commanders know the difference between pride and the mission. Merrick was already down behind her rifle before he finished the sentence. She didn't fire wild. She built her position first, even with rounds snapping over the ridge, settled the bipod into a hollow that gave her a stable read on the wind coming up the valley, checked her data card against the range she'd walked and measured the evening before while the rest of us slept, and only then put her eye to the scope. I crouched beside her feeding range corrections off my binoculars because Vance had ordered me to, and I watched her hands. They were perfectly still, unhurried in a way that felt almost wrong given the chaos below us, like she had already decided the outcome and was simply walking through the motions required to arrive at it. "Winds shifting out of the northwest, maybe 4 miles an hour," she said, more to herself than to me, adjusting her turret with 2 clicks before she'd fired a single round. "Give it a beat before you call anything past 600. Her first shot took the machine gunner anchoring the enemy's left flank, the one raking Price's squad with the heaviest fire. One round, center mass, 400 meters past what most riflemen on that ridge would have called their effective range. The gun went quiet mid-burst. She'd already shifted before the body finished falling. "Second gun, right side, in the rocks," she said, flat, and put a round through the gap between 2 boulders that most of us hadn't even clocked as a firing position. That gunner died reaching for his weapon's charging handle. 2 guns down in under 40 seconds, and Price's squad had a window to move that they hadn't had all morning. Vance watched through his binoculars, uncapped now, silent. Merrick worked the tree line like a checklist. A fighter running low along a fold in the ground to flank Price's position. She led him by half a body length and dropped him before he reached cover. A man rising to lob a grenade toward our pinned squad. She took him at the top of his throw, and the grenade fell short, harmless, into empty grass, and one of Price's men let out a shout that was half relief and half disbelief. She called her own shots to me in short bursts. I relayed to Price's radio so his men would know which threats were already gone, and which still needed their attention, and every single call she made turned out to be exactly right. I asked her once, months later, how she'd kept the count so clean under that kind of pressure, expecting some trick of breathing or focus. She told me she simply didn't let herself think about the 8th target while she was still finishing the 7th. That panic was just a man's attention trying to be in two places at once, and she'd trained herself out of the habit years before Anders Hollow ever happened. It was the only time I heard her explain any part of what she did that morning, and even then it sounded less like a secret and more like arithmetic. "Third position, tree with the broken crown, 11 o'clock from the boulder," she said, and I found it through my binoculars only after she fired, the shape of a man collapsing back into brush I hadn't even registered as occupied. By the 4-minute mark she had killed 7. Price's squad had used the opening she was carving to fall back into a defensible line along a drainage ditch, dragging one wounded man with them, and the enemy's rate of fire had dropped by half because half their shooters were no longer capable of shooting. Vance keyed his radio to Price. "Report." "We're moving, sir. We're—" A pause, disbelief plain in his voice even over the static. "Sir, whoever's on that ridge is clearing a lane for us. I don't know how she's finding them." "She's finding them because she spent last night walking every meter of that ground with a rangefinder while the rest of this camp slept," Vance said, and I heard something shift in his voice, doubt cracking open into something closer to awe, though he wasn't ready to call it that yet. The enemy commander, whoever he was, finally understood what was killing his men and tried to break contact, ordering a shift toward a shallow wash that would have given his remaining fighters cover to withdraw north along the river. Merrick read the movement before the first man reached the wash line. She didn't chase them shot for shot, and for a moment I thought she'd lost them, the tree line gone quiet and empty through my binoculars. She picked the choke point they'd have to cross instead, a gap between two rock outcrops barely 3 meters wide, and waited, breathing slow, patient as stone, while I watched the seconds tick by and wondered how she could stand the not shooting when every instinct in me wanted her firing at anything that moved. "They'll come through there," she said, without lowering the scope. "There's no other way north from that wash without crossing open water, and they know it, and I know it, and in about 10 seconds one of them is going to decide the risk is worth it anyway." The first fighter broke into the gap at a dead run. She took him. The second tried to vault the low rocks instead, and she adjusted half a click and took him too, and after that nobody else tried to cross, which told her the rest had gone to ground rather than run the gauntlet she'd built out of 2 rocks and perfect timing. 9, she said quietly and kept scanning. The remaining fighters, maybe a dozen by then, tried one last coordinated rush at Price's drainage ditch line, hoping numbers might do what stealth hadn't. Merrick took 3 more in the 11 seconds it took them to cross open ground, and Price's squad, no longer pinned, no longer bleeding, finished the job with disciplined, controlled fire of their own men who had spent the whole engagement flat on their bellies, suddenly fighting like a unit again, because someone had bought them the room to remember how. 12 enemy down by her rifle alone. 5 minutes and 11 seconds from her first shot to her last, a number I only knew because I'd been timing it on my watch without deciding to, the way you count something unconsciously when you're watching a thing happen that you've never seen happen before. The valley went quiet. Smoke drifted off the tree line. Price's voice came over the radio again, steadier now, reading off a head count that included every one of his men, wounded but alive, all 20 accounted for. Vance lowered his binoculars slowly, like his arms had forgotten how heavy they were supposed to feel. He looked at Merrick, who was already breaking her position down, cleaning grit from the bolt with the same unhurried care she'd shown building it, as if the last 5 minutes had been an ordinary chore finished on schedule rather than the thing that had just saved his lieutenant's entire squad. Below us, medics were moving through the drainage ditch checking Price's wounded, and I could hear their voices carrying up the slope, relief flattening into the businesslike tone men use when the worst has passed, and there's paperwork instead of grief ahead of them. Nobody down there yet knew whose rifle had bought them that outcome. That knowledge belonged, for the moment, only to the handful of us still on the ridge. "Sergeant," he said, "how long did it take you to walk that ground last night?" 4 hours, sir. I wanted the wind lanes memorized before I needed them." She said it the way another soldier might report the weather. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he did something I hadn't expected from a man who 20 minutes earlier had been ready to argue her off his ridge. He picked up his own rifle, safety on, and carried it over to where she knelt, and set it down beside her gear like an offering, a small unspoken acknowledgement that she alone had earned the right to decide when a weapon on that ridge got used and when it didn't. "From here forward," he said, loud enough that the whole command element heard it, "Sergeant Merrick has authority over every rifle on this overwatch. Nobody fires without her call unless I say otherwise, and I am not going to say otherwise." Nobody argued. Nobody laughed the way some of them might have laughed at that order an hour earlier. Price, once his squad had linked up with the ridge element, walked straight to her and said nothing at all, just extended his hand, and she shook it, and that was its own kind of speech. I carried Vance's radio for 4 more months under her overwatch after that morning, and I watched him change in small ways nobody announced. He started routing every ridge plan through her first, asking her opinion on approach lines before he finalized anything, deferring in meetings where 6 weeks earlier he would have simply given an order. He stopped explaining her presence to visiting officers and started introducing her instead by name, by rank, by what she'd done at Anders Hollow, like a man correcting a debt he intended to keep paying down for as long as it took. Price, for his part, requested her on every overwatch his squad ever ran afterward, and made no secret of why. He told me once, over a cup of bad coffee in the mess tent, that he'd spent that morning in the drainage ditch expecting to write letters home to 20 families, and instead he'd walked every one of his men back to camp on their own legs. He said he didn't much care what anyone's file said after that. He cared what he'd seen with his own eyes, and what he'd seen was a woman who could do in 5 minutes what most units couldn't manage in an hour with 3 times the guns. I think about the sentence he never got to finish that morning, the one about how a woman with 11 months in theater ended up running his overwatch. He never picked it back up, not once, not even as a joke. Some questions get answered so completely that repeating them afterward would only embarrass the man who asked. Vance understood that. It was, in its own quiet way, the most respect I ever saw him pay to anyone under his command.